Okay, I hope you had a restful spring break. And now let's get back to macroeconomics. And I'm going to spend some time reminding you of stuff we did before break. Okay, so I'm just going to go over chapter 13. So to quickly remind you here, this is a chapter about aggregate demand and aggregate supply. So the whole idea here is that we are going to view the economy as if it were a single market, correct? And we know what the appropriate diagram for a market is, right? This is what it looks like. A demand curve and a supply curve. But remember, this is the entire economy, so what we're measuring along the horizontal or quantity axis is going to be a measure of all final goods and services produced in the economy. And we know that our measure of that is real GDP. So we measure real GDP along the quantity axis, represented by the letter Y. So this here is all final goods and services, correct? What do we measure along the vertical axis? Well, that's going to be all prices, correct? And what is our measure of all prices? It's called the price level, which we have interpreted as something related to the GDP price index. It's actually the GDP price index divided by 100. So this is a measure of all prices. Prices of final goods and services, right? And the negatively sloped curve here is called the aggregate demand curve, and the positively sloped curve is called the aggregate supply curve. So A stands for aggregate. Aggregate means total. So that's aggregate demand, as in the demand for all final goods and services. Right? Now we have macroeconomic equilibrium in this story where the two curves intersect, as we know. So this is where the two curves intersect. And so this is where we have macroeconomic equilibrium, right? And that equilibrium gives rise to a certain equilibrium level of real GDP and a certain equilibrium price level. So this we are going to call Y star. Y star is equilibrium real GDP, and P star is the equilibrium price level. So this here is the equilibrium price level, and this here is equilibrium real GDP. Right? Now, how do we portray a recession in this story? Well, this is the way we do it, as we've learned in class before. I'm just, again, reminding you of stuff we did before break, just bringing you up to speed again. The way we can depict a recession here is by marking off on this horizontal axis potential GDP, Y sub F. So what is Y sub F again? That is the economy's potential GDP, also known as full employment real GDP. Now in this diagram, we've marked YF, potential GDP, to the right of the current equilibrium real GDP. Now what is the implication of this? Now we know that when the economy is producing GDP level Y sub F, potential GDP, we have full employment in the economy. Now, what's the meaning of full employment? All resources are being fully employed. Now, we don't mean that quite literally, because all labor is not going to be employed, right? Even when we have full employment, about 4% of the labor force continues to be unemployed. These 4% are called what's the word for this kind of unemployment? The naturally unemployed. These guys are the naturally unemployed. 4% consist of the frictionally and the structurally unemployed. So these are workers who are always going to be around. Now, it's not the same workers, remember. There is some circulation going on here. So you can think of this as a pail or a bucket containing unemployed individuals, the naturally unemployed. People leave this bucket, and the new people enter this bucket. This happens every day. Okay? But the point is that at any point in time, you are going to have some people in that bucket, the naturally unemployed. So these are workers who are, let's say, between jobs. They have skills, but let's say they've moved from one city or town to another, and it takes them a while to find a new job in their new place of residence. In that interim, they are frictionally unemployed, correct? Or you may have workers who've been laid off from sectors of the economy that are dying on account of changing technologies, changing patterns of comparative advantage, etc. Right? And so these workers are structurally unemployed. Now, the point here is that at GDP level YF, if the economy were producing GDP level YF, the unemployment rate in the economy would be how much? About 4%. On the other hand, currently this economy is producing GDP level Y star, which is less than YF. Right? A smaller amount of GDP requires fewer workers to produce it. Is that correct? So the level of employment at GDP level Y star shall be less than full employment. Correct? Now, less employment, of course, translates as more unemployment. So at GDP level Y star, the unemployment rate shall exceed the natural rate. So you should have, in this case, say 7, 8, 9% unemployment instead of 4%. Now the difference, 9 minus 4 is 5, right? Now that 5% consists of what kind of unemployment? Cyclical unemployment. So you have now, in addition to the naturally unemployed, who exist when the economy produces GDP level YF, you now have, in addition to those workers, you have some cyclically unemployed workers. Right? Now this gap between Y star and YF, this gap is called a recessionary gap. That is a recessionary gap. That's an economy in recession. This is how we would portray an economy in recession. Now, as I said, the remainder of this course is going to be dedicated to figuring out how this economy can come out of recession. Principally, what can the government and the Federal Reserve Bank, what can the government on the one hand and the Fed on the other? The Fed stands for the Federal Reserve Bank. What can these two entities do to help this economy narrow that recessionary gap or even completely eliminate it? Right? The remainder of this course is going to be dedicated to that issue. Right? As I've told you before, the way to narrow that gap, the steps taken by the government and the Fed to narrow that gap principally focus on shifting the AD curve rightwards. So the steps the Fed and the government take are steps to stimulate demand in the economy. Correct? Because if demand is stimulated, what will happen here in this diagram is that this AD curve that you see here will shift to the right like this. And when the curve shifts to the right like that, we end up with a new equilibrium. And where is that new equilibrium going to be? The intersection of the new AD curve and the AS curve. This, of course, translates to a new level of equilibrium real GDP, which I'm going to call Y double star. What has happened here is that the recessionary gap has narrowed, as you can see. It's a smaller recessionary gap than before. It's only that much now. Now, a further rightward shift of the AD curve may completely eliminate that gap. Do you follow me? So basically, the steps taken by these guys are going to be steps to boost AD in the economy. Right? Now, I'd like you to think a little bit about AD. Who are the people responsible for AD? Who are the ones whose behavior brings about the AD curve? In other words, who are the shoppers in our economy? Who are the shoppers? Remember, we have 4 shoppers in our economy. Who are they? Households who are responsible for the C, consumption spending. Then we have the government, and the government is responsible for G, government spending, correct? Then we have firms themselves. And what are the final goods that firms buy? Machines, right? And so that is called investment spending. And then we have the rest of the world. And what are they responsible for? Net exports. So these are the 4 shoppers who lie behind the AD curve. So what the government and the Fed will do then to stimulate shopping by these 4, or at least some of these 4, right? That's going to be the subject material of the remainder of this course. What can the government and the Fed do to cause at least some of these 4 to increase their shopping? Because that is what's going to pull the economy out of recession. That's story simple enough? And everything we do now will hinge upon this. So everything will come back to this diagram, right? We spent some time understanding exactly why the AD curve was negatively sloped and why the aggregate supply curve was positively sloped. I'm not going to go back to that now, but I am going to briefly discuss or remind you of the factors that, in fact, cause the aggregate demand curve to shift. Okay? So let me go to a new page here. So let's now discuss the various factors that would cause the aggregate demand curve to shift rightwards. I'm going to now speak of this in terms of the 4 components, right? I'm going to speak in terms of C, I, G, and X minus M. Let me quickly talk about these separately, okay? Let's start with C. What are the influences on C? Consumption spending by households, right? Now, there are going to be 2 factors that the Fed and the government control. Now, what the government controls is called fiscal policy. And fiscal policy is policy about taxation and government spending. Let's focus on the taxation bit for a second. If the government reduced these taxes, if the government taxed us less, what would that do to household consumption spending, do you think? Go up, right? If the government charges us less taxes, we would have more disposable income. We would have more income to spend. And so it's likely then that we would shop more. So a cut in taxes would tend to increase consumption spending and therefore shift the aggregate demand curve to the right like that. Is that correct? What about government spending? Could that have an effect on consumption spending? In fact, this will be the subject matter of our next chapter when we speak about the aggregate demand multiplier, or the fiscal multiplier. If the government were to increase its spending, if this were to go up, would that have an effect on household spending, do you think? I'd like you now to think back to the Great Depression. I don't know if you've encountered that. Have you encountered the Great Depression in some course before? What course would that be? History? Right. When did the Great Depression start? Does anyone remember the date? What year? 1929 is correct. So the Great Depression began in 1929. When did it end? Exactly. Once we entered World War II. And when would that be, approximately? The US entered the war in 1941, of course. For the Europeans, the war began earlier, right, 1939. But around the early 1940s, 1941 or so, that's when the Depression ended. Right? Now, during this period, who was president? Or at least for a large part of this period? FDR. Correct? Franklin Roosevelt. Now, during the Great Depression, what did Franklin Roosevelt do to help the economy climb out of this recession? Pardon me? The New Deal. And what was that about, really? Well, one of the aspects of this was a big increase in government spending. On what? The government in the 1930s began to spend a lot of money building things, public works projects. If you're keen on camping, and if you've ever been to Texas state parks, do you know that most of them were built during the Great Depression? The government built a lot of highways, dams. The Hoover Dam was built in this era. So what was all that about? Why was FDR spending all this government money to build things? Because people would be directly employed in these various construction projects. Is that correct? So right away we start creating jobs. And does that have an impact on consumption spending, is my question. It does, right? All these people who get employed building the Hoover Dam, they get paychecks from the government, correct? Right? And what do they do with this money? Of course, they go and spend it, right? So an increase in government spending then, an increase in government spending causes an increase in consumption spending. Is that correct? So all these people on the government payroll now start to spend their paychecks, and this increases consumption spending. However, the story doesn't end there. Because when they spend money, let's say that I'm a person employed by FDR on one of his public works projects, and I get my paycheck and I spend it in my community. The money I spend goes into the cash register of a store in town, and where does it go from there? And doesn't that money go to pay the workers in that store? You follow me? Now, the workers in the store get this money. What do they do with it? Well, they go and spend it in their own stores in their neighborhoods. Do you see what I'm saying? So there is a cascading effect. Do you follow me? The government starts the ball rolling by giving me my paycheck, but then when I spend it, I send the money on to somebody else, who then spends it, and that money goes to somebody else, who then spends it, etc. Do you follow what I'm saying? So you have here a rather big increase in consumption spending from a pretty small increase in government spending. You have, in other words, a multiplied effect on consumption spend. And this is going to be what we'll study in the next chapter. Okay? So an increase in government spending also would then shift the AD curve to the right, directly as well as indirectly. You see, when G goes up, you have a direct effect. And the direct effect is because G is part of AD. That's the direct effect. But then there is also the indirect effect. Why? Because an increase in G causes an increase in C. So there are two effects of an increase in government spending. Okay, next. Let's talk about the Fed's monetary policy. The Fed's monetary policy. Now, what is this about? What does the Fed principally control? The Fed has nothing to do with government spending or taxation. The Fed controls, does anyone know from reading the papers or anything? Every now and then the chairman of the Fed and the board of governors meet and they make an important announcement usually. And an announcement is listened to very carefully by Wall Street. And usually what they're looking for is what the Fed's plans are about future interest rates. Do you follow me? The Fed controls certain key interest rates. And we'll talk about that also later on in this course. So the Fed really controls interest rates. Now, how would interest rates affect consumption spending in the economy? Is there a connection between interest rates and consumption spending? Shopping by households? Well, if the local car dealership starts offering car loans at 0% APR, now would that cause more people to buy those cars? It would, wouldn't it? In other words, if the interest rate is low, we consumers are more likely to borrow money with which to go shopping. Correct? We'd be more likely to buy things on credit, and that's important here. Right? So if the interest rate is lowered, and my symbol for the interest rate is the lowercase letter r, if r is reduced, this is going to cause consumption spending to rise. Does it make sense? Because more people will borrow money with which to go shopping. There'll be more use of credit cards, etc. Right? So this is how the Fed controls or affects consumption spending in the economy. So we have fiscal policy, monetary policy. The next factor that affects consumption spending is household expectations. Household expectations about the future. In other words, are households optimistic or pessimistic? If households are optimistic about their future, if they think that they are going to get pay rises at work, that's when they are more likely to go shopping today. On the other hand, if they are pessimistic about the future, if they are uncertain about their jobs, if they think they're going to get a pink slip in the near future, that's when they are less likely to go shopping. Household wealth has something to do with consumption spending also. And household wealth could be real estate, which is the commonest form of wealth holding in the States, or let's say the stock market. If there is a boom in the real estate market or a boom in the stock market, this is likely to increase household wealth in the States. Is that correct? If the value of your home goes up a great deal, you are going to feel wealthier. And when you feel wealthier, what does that do to your consumption spending? Let's say that the value of my home goes up by $100,000. That's going to make me feel wealthier, correct? And when I feel wealthier, what do? I may feel optimistic enough to go shopping more. Where am I going to get the money from to go shopping more, by the way? My home is not spitting out money. The value of the home has gone up, but I'm still living in it. How then would I shop more? I would essentially spend more of my current income, my paycheck. I would save less. You follow me? Because I would think, hey, my home's gone up in value, and so that might take care of a part of my retirement. When I retire, I might sell this house and move somewhere cheaper, or move into a little apartment or condo or something. So I need to save less for my future. If I need to save less for my future, of course, I can go spend more now. That's how it's going to work. You see? So an increase in your wealth is going to cause you to save a smaller part of your current paycheck, spend more. So these are the factors that, or the important factors that affect consumption spending. Right? Next, let's focus on investment spending. So what are the influences on investment spending? Again, we have government fiscal policy. And again, this is about taxes and government spending. Correct? Well, in this case, our focus is going to be on the taxes that businesses pay, such as the corporate income tax. The argument here is that if the government cut these taxes, businesses would be left with more of their revenues with which to buy new machines. So if the government cuts the corporate income tax rate, corporations would be able to invest more. Right? So that's how government fiscal policy affects the purchase of new machinery by businesses. What about monetary policy? Which, of course, is policy about the interest rate, correct? Now, if the Fed reduces interest rates, would that affect the purchase of machinery by businesses? It would, right? Why? Because businesses, too, often buy new machines on credit, correct? So if the interest rate on those loans is reduced, firms are more likely then to go borrowing money with which to build new factories, for instance. Now, even if a firm has the money already and doesn't need to borrow, would a lowering of the interest rate affect its decision to buy a new machine? So now you have a firm that already has the funds. It doesn't need to borrow. And the Fed lowers interest rates. Would this firm be more likely to build that new factory? Why? It doesn't need to borrow. It has the funds. Well, here the argument is going to be like this. The firm has the funds, but it has a choice of what to do with it. It can build that factory and use that factory to generate profits into the future, or it could take that sum of money and simply put that into a bank account earning some interest. Do you follow me? So here are the two choices then. Use the money to buy machines, build a factory, or put the money in the bank and earn some interest on it. Now, if the Fed lowers interest rates, wouldn't that make the latter choice less attractive, meaning putting the money in the bank and earning interest? Do you follow me? So even if a firm has the funds, a lowering of the interest rate is going to make it more likely to use that money to buy machines, because that will be the more attractive proposition. Parking that money in a bank account, earning interest, is going to be less attractive now because interest rates have fallen. Banks now going to be paying out less interest. Correct? Either way, a lowering of the interest rate causes investment spending to rise. And another influence, a third influence on investment spending would be business expectations about the future. In other words, business optimism versus pessimism. If businesses are optimistic about the future, that's when they are more likely to go buying new machines, building new factories. On the other hand, if they are pessimistic about the future, they'll be less likely to do this. Right, so here are the influences on I. So we've dealt with C, we've dealt with I. I'm going to leave G for the end, and now I'm going to talk about X minus M. What are the influences on net exports? How much the US exports versus what it imports? Well, one important factor, of course, is going to be economic conditions abroad in our trading partners. Which countries are our important trading partners? Well, I believe the US's biggest trading partner is Canada. And Mexico is probably second. Right? Now let's consider Mexico, since we live here at the border with Mexico. So let's see what economic conditions in Mexico will do to US net exports. Let's say that the Mexican economy suffers a recession. So we have the Mexican economy suffering a recession. How will this affect US net exports? Is there likely to be some connection between economic conditions in Mexico and United States net exports? Well, if the Mexicans become poorer, are they more likely to buy US goods or less likely? Less likely, is that correct? So what will that do to our exports to Mexico? Is that correct? So when economic conditions in Mexico sour, if they become bad, then our exports to Mexico will reduce, clearly, because they will have less money to buy our goods. There'll be less Mexican shoppers crossing the border, for instance, and shopping here in our malls and so on. Correct? So with a reduction in our exports, of course, that means that our net exports shall fall, because a fall in X causes a fall in X minus M. Right? On the other hand, if there is an economic boom in Mexico, if the Mexican economy does very well, well, that is going to cause our net exports to go up, because they would shop more here. By the way, does anyone know what's happening to the Mexican economy lately? Is it doing well, badly? Anyone have a sense? Actually, it's been doing a bit poorly of late. Their growth rates have been very low. The US economy has been growing at about 2%. The Mexican economy last year grew at about 0.7%. It's growing very slowly. And one of the reasons, of course, is, can anyone guess? It has to do with the gas pump. Any thoughts? Well, what is a big export of Mexico? Oil, correct? And oil prices have greatly reduced, right? And that is one reason why the Mexican economy has been suffering, okay? So point is, economic conditions abroad affect net exports. So if our trading partners are prospering, well, that is going to make them more likely to buy our goods, and that will shift the AD curve to the right, because we'll be selling more to them. They'll be shopping more here, right? Another factor that affects net exports is the currency exchange rate. The currency exchange rate. Now, how does that affect net exports? Now, here again, we can think about the dollar-peso rate. What is it these days? Has anyone been across lately? About 15, isn't it? 50. Now, not very long ago, it used to be more like 12 or 13. Correct? Now, when a dollar becomes equal to 15 pesos as opposed to 12 pesos, what's happening to the peso? Is it becoming stronger or weaker? If the dollar equals 15 pesos instead of the old 12 pesos, is the peso becoming weaker or stronger? Weaker. The peso is becoming weaker and the dollar is becoming stronger. Is that correct? Now, when the dollar becomes stronger / peso becomes weaker, what happens to US exports to Mexico, do you think? Would they be more likely to buy our goods or less likely to buy our goods? Well, let's think about the Mexican shoppers across the border to shop here in Brownsville. If it takes them 15 pesos to buy a dollar now, wouldn't American goods seem more expensive to them? Right? Anything that has a dollar price tag will now seem like more pesos to them. And so they would be less likely to buy US goods. Is that correct? They'd shop less here. So in other words, a stronger dollar implies a reduction in net exports. In other words, a stronger dollar would tend to cause the AD curve to shift to the left or right? Come on. A stronger dollar would cause the AD curve to shift to the right or the left? Left, exactly. Because there would be less US net exports. One of the four shoppers, foreigners, would buy less from us with a stronger dollar. A weaker dollar, on the other hand, would cause them to buy more from us, and us to buy less from them, by the way. That matters too. Imports, you see. If the dollar becomes stronger, what happens? They buy less from us, but we buy more from them because their goods seem cheaper to us. So X falls and M rises, and that causes X minus M to fall. A leftward shift in the AD curve. Correct? A weaker dollar, on the other hand, is more likely to boost our economy. Is more likely to cause demand in our economy to go up and an equilibrium GDP to go up, therefore. Okay? And I said I would leave government spending to the end, right? So let's talk about government spending. And I left that for the end because government spending is something that government decides. It isn't influenced by other factors. G, in other words, is autonomous. It is determined deliberately by the government as part of its fiscal policy. Now, why did the Great Depression end only when the World War began, Second World War? Can anyone shed some light on that? Began in 1929 and lasted the entire decade of the 30s, and only ended in the early 40s when the US entered the war. What's the connection between the war and the end of the Great Depression? Somebody. Increased government spending, precisely. Now, this is something that was already going on with FDR's New Deal, but once the war came, government spending increased even further on the military, on the war effort. You follow me? The government began to order ships and planes and vehicles and all kinds of things, and all our auto manufacturers in Detroit basically began to produce military equipment. Am I correct? This big increase in government spending then caused these factories to expand hugely, hire more and more workers. And you'd be interested to know that a lot of these new hires were women, correct? Because a lot of the men were drafted, right? And so you had this big increase in employment in the States. And of course, that led to more paychecks being spent in local economies. And as I've said before, that this money that is spent will just keep passing from hand to hand, from hand to hand. Am I correct? And so there will be this magnified, multiplied impact, positive impact on the economy. And that's why the Great Depression came to an end, only when the US entered the war. Right? Because the war signified a big increase in government spend. Right? And so this, I suppose, brings you up to speed with this chapter. Right? And before I end, I'm going to talk about one more thing before I stop. And that is, we have a couple of minutes here. So let's say that we have an economy in recession. Let's go back to my previous diagram here. We have an economy in recession. There is a recessionary gap. Would something automatic happen? In other words, could the economy self-regulate? Could it come back to full employment on its own? Is the question I'm now posing to you. In other words, is it possible for the economy to come back to full employment without government or Fed intervention? So let me quickly draw this diagram here. Right? And we have this as our Y star, and this here is YF. We have a recession. So we have a recession, and a recession tends to lead to high unemployment. Would high unemployment have any sort of effect on nominal wages? Is there a likely link between high unemployment and the paychecks that firms pay out, the hourly wages that they pay out, the nominal wages? Well, some economists argue that there might be this connection. See, when you have a horde of unemployed workers out there, firms might say, well, maybe I can get away paying my workers less, because if they protest, I can always sack them and hire all these desperate people out there, these desperate unemployed workers. Is that correct? So some economists argue that high unemployment tends to cause nominal wages to fall. And can someone recall the effect of falling nominal wages on this diagram? What happens when the nominal wage W falls? Does anyone recall? Well, we're holding the price level constant and we're reducing the nominal wage. What does that do to the real wage? The real wage is W by P, correct? So we have W falling and the price level constant. Of course, that causes the real wage to drop. Is that correct? When the real wage drops, what happens to firms hiring of workers? They hire more workers, exactly. Right? Firms increase hiring. And when firms increase hiring, what happens to their output of real GDP? They produce more GDP. So what do we have here? We have this connected with that. Same price level, more output. Now, how do you think about that? Now, wouldn't that translate to, in a small diagram here, what would that translate to? Tell me. So this is the price level P over bar. And firms used to produce output Y1, but now they are producing output Y2. Same price level, firms have increased their output. Why? Because the nominal wage has dropped. Now this point here doesn't lie in space. Am I correct? Where does it lie? It lies on a whole new supply curve. So what am I saying here then? Essentially what I'm saying is that when the nominal wage drops, the AS curve shifts right, or rightwards. So in other words, what's going to happen, according to some economists, when there is a recession, there'll be high unemployment. High unemployment will cause nominal wages to fall. And when the nominal wage falls, what happens to aggregate supply? So we have the aggregate supply curve shifting to the right. What does that do to the new equilibrium real GDP? We now have equilibrium here. And that translates to a higher level of real GDP. What has happened to the recessionary gap? The recessionary gap used to be this, but it is now going to be, it's narrowed, hasn't it? And some economists argue that this process would in fact bring the economy back to full employment on its own. So this is the idea of a self-regulating economy. The economy would come back to full employment on its own because A, nominal wages would drop. Am I correct? This would cause the AS curve to shift to the right, and this would narrow the recessionary gap on its own without any government or Fed intervention. Right? So this is something that economists believe. This was, however, discredited during the Great Depression because the Great Depression didn't just automatically go away. It lasted a whole decade. Right? And I will stop here today.